With heavy hearts, we recognize the violence facing Asian American communities, including the most recent incident in Georgia on Tuesday, March 16th. What happened in Georgia has really struck an emotional chord with all of us here at NCAT and the North Carolina Pan-Asian community. We witness and share in the collective grief and mourning during this time.
On the night of March 16th, 8 people were murdered in massage parlors in Georgia. 6 of the victims were Asian. This is another tragedy on top of the anti-Asian hate that has been mounting over the last year.
This violence against Asian communities is not new. We just passed the 6-year mark since our 3 winners, Razan, Dia, and Yusor, were murdered during an Islamophobic attack in Chapel Hill. This racist and discriminatory hate is part of the fabric of our everyday lives, and it shouldn't be. In the last year alone, there have been over 30 anti-Asian incidents reported in North Carolina.
Our community is being forced to deal with the rise in anti-Asian violence at the same time that we are still suffering from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that this pandemic has disproportionately harmed our communities and other communities of color.
At first glance, Asian American communities may appear to be doing well, but we are not a monolith. The worst impacts of COVID-19, like many of the attacks that we have witnessed over this past year, have been disproportionately felt by the most vulnerable among us, including the elderly, low-wage workers, and people with limited English proficiency.
Philippine XAO nurses are at a higher risk of contracting COVID-19. Nearly 1/3 of nurses in the United States who have died from COVID-19 have been Philippine XAO. Additionally, Bangladeshi Americans, many of whom are working class, contract COVID-19 at higher rates. These examples are reflective of the broader inequities that are routinely made invisible in our communities.
When speaking to the rise of anti-Asian violence during the pandemic, it is impossible to ignore the harmful and inaccurate racialization of the coronavirus as Asian. Such racist discourse as espoused by the previous presidential administration links back to a much longer history. Dating back centuries, East Asians were lumped together as an existential danger to Western countries during the racist label Yellow Peril.
We also understand this violence in the broader context of Islamophobia and xenophobia, as our government continues to attack and otherize immigrant communities. People continue to be deported and caged, regardless of which party is in power in the U.S. Earlier this month, we saw 33 Vietnamese people deported, including Hugh Huynh, a 49-year-old refugee who arrived in 1980 with his family after fleeing the aftermath of the war in Vietnam.
This most recent attack in Georgia speaks to the dual misogyny and racism that Asian women face. Authorities have hesitated to call the Atlanta attacks racially motivated because the attackers seem to have other motivations, like a quote-unquote sexual addiction, and that the attacker frequented those massage parlors.
This ignores the long history of fetishization of Asian women and sexual violence against body workers. This phenomenon has been referred to as yellow fever, often in jest, but with real consequences of violence, like the murders we saw in Georgia and across the country.
These examples demonstrate some of the ways in which anti-Asian violence is ingrained in our society. This violence takes many forms, and our pain is often invisible.
What shows up in the form of interpersonal violence, from casual jokes, harassment, and shunning all the way up to murder, is a symptom of a larger system of state violence built from white supremacy.
We recognize white supremacy as not only individual acts of a few, but rather a larger system we all live under, which has otherized people through rhetoric, discrimination, immigration policy, and denying equitable resources to address basic needs like housing, healthcare access, food, and safety for all communities of color.
Our pain and trauma is being used as a wedge between communities in the form of the model minority myth. We are incorrectly and harmfully lumped together into a monolith, effectively erasing our diversity and struggles.
We refuse to be used as media fodder, as a tool in the system. We recognize that all oppression is connected and that we are not alone in experiencing this state-sanctioned violence.
Solidarity is the only way forward.
We must recognize the connection between our communities and the violence we face each day in all its forms.
We cannot break these cycles of oppression without addressing our histories and healing our generational traumas, the ways we have harmed and been harmed.
We must stand together and put forth community solutions that do not perpetuate these cycles.
We all hold and handle loss differently, between generations, communities, cultures, and as individuals. One of the most revolutionary things we can do is be graceful with ourselves and others during hard times, and create moments to slow down, take a breath, and remember that we're not alone. Now is the time to hold the victims, their families, and one another in our hearts.